A long-term investor stares death in the face and lives to tell the story. Today we talk about what happened, what he's learned from it, and how it's changed his perspective on investing and life. That's coming up right after this. Welcome to Big Technology Podcast, a show for cool-headed, nuanced conversation of the tech world and beyond. Today we have I think it's going to be a fascinating episode for you, something different. As we round out our summer coverage, I want to bring you the story that Eric Markowitz has to tell. He's a partner at Nightview Capital, which is a long-term focused investment company, and also somebody that I know from journalism circles. I've been a fan of his work for quite some time, and recently a story he wrote about a health scare came across my timeline and just absolutely floored me, had me sort of standing in place for a few moments. Following reading it. And I thought it was important to get Eric's story to you as we sort of, are in a part of the year where we take a step back and think about life and think about what's in store moving forward. And so, Eric, I'm so glad to have you. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you, Alex.
So let's start at the very beginning here. What happened to you in early 2023?
Yeah, I mean, we can start there, but I think it's actually probably even more practical to start what happened a little bit before that, which was in 2022. I wrote about it in the piece, but for all intents and purposes, I was a fairly healthy, mid-30s guy, married kid, working a job in finance and investing. And 2022 was a really rough year. It was very stressful. And towards the later part of the year, I think that the stress started to really wear me down. And, all of a sudden in like January 2023, just woke up one day and didn't feel right. I'd previously kind of been feeling fine, no major health problems. But the major symptom I was getting, which was very bizarre, was like an intense vertigo, dizziness, and nausea, which I hadn't experienced before. If you've ever, maybe had a few too many to drink and you're sitting in bed that night and the room's kind of spinning, that was the feeling, but it was constant, and I don't really drink, so it wasn't related to that.
What do you think it was initially, like when that started happening? Were you like, I just need to sleep more, or what was
I thought it was
feeling?
like maybe some sort of bug. I told my wife, I was like, I just don't feel right. I'm just going to go lay down. And then it just kind of got worse and worse, to the point where I was like projectile vomiting and pretty intense symptoms. So went to the hospital. They kind of initiated stroke protocol. So did an MRI of my brain. And the scan, as far as the radiologist read it, came back clean. So the doctors were kind of a little bit confused, but said maybe it's something like an inner ear disorder, BPV, maybe something called labyrinthitis, like an inner ear infection that causes some like vestibular issues, and it'll go away. So a few days ago, I was discharged, go back home. We were in Santa Barbara where my wife's family is, and, it just got worse. So it was a constant state of just the room spinning, constant nausea, constant vomiting. I just couldn't keep food down. It was very scary, as you can imagine, where, you just have this like intense vertigo. And for anyone who's experienced it, it's very unpleasant, bordering on terrifying and quite miserable. So went back to the hospital.
How long did it take you between when you were sent home and they said, well, it's probably nothing, to when you went back to the hospital?
So I actually about a day later, I went to go see a ENT specialist.
Ear, nose, and throat.
Yep. Ear, nose, and throat. And they checked me out. And I mean, I was really in bad shape in his waiting room, and I just started vomiting in the waiting room. And to his credit, he said, "You're not good, man. Like, you need to go back to the hospital. Like, this isn't normal." So went back to the hospital, stayed there for 2 to 3 days, I think 3 days maybe, and still kind of like no answers. They gave me fluids. That was primarily what happened at the hospital, and was checked out. And the situation was kind of getting worse and worse, and yet was discharged. I think with the idea being, we're not really helping him. We'll just see if he can get maybe a little bit better on his own. He's stable right now. In retrospect, probably should have stayed at the hospital, probably should have advocated for that. But, hindsight is 2020, of course. And again, like that initial, I think the key thing here is the initial scan was read as, no problems with my brain. So, fast forward, a few days, then a couple of weeks. We live in Portland, Oregon, so we flew back up, which was kind of a harrowing experience. My father-in-law had to come. I was wheeled onto the plane in a wheelchair. Couldn't really walk. Any sort of slight movement of my head just triggered like intense nausea, vomiting, vertigo. Got back to Portland though, and went and saw a few more specialists. Everyone was kind of, just very confused by it, couldn't really explain it. I think going back, because the initial scan, the radiologist read it as no problems. So, at some point, I think this was like February, mid-February of 2023. So about a month passed. And at that point, I had lost about 35 pounds in a month. I was kind of deteriorating, really couldn't get out of bed. Couldn't sleep because any sort of like motion would just trigger intense nausea. Quite literally suffering. I mean, just really deteriorating. And I think like, just taking a step back, like I felt like this is just like it was just so bizarre because like I had been pretty healthy up until that point. I hadn't really experienced any sort of like major health crisis. And for anyone who's gone through it, especially when you have like an answer, at least there's a path to some sort of treatment. But for me, because there was this sort of, what in retrospect was a misdiagnosis, there was no real answer of what I should be doing. So the main kind of commentary from doctors up until that point was just wait it out. Maybe it'll get better. My wife, who, is amazing, who kind of kept me like literally alive during this period, like just bringing food, just scheduling doctor's appointments, just like literally getting me through the day, like the physical side, also the emotional side. To her credit, really advocated for a second MRI. So a good friend of mine picked me up, went to the ER to do another MRI, and came out of the MRI machine, and it's like the tap you never want to get. They were like, the radiologist wants to speak with you. So they put me in a little booth. They hand me a phone, and I guess it's all done remotely these days. So the doctor on the other line just says, you have to get to the ER right away. You have I think the words used was a rapidly enhancing lesion in your brain, on your cerebellum, which is your brainstem. I asked him what it could be. He was kind of hesitant to give answers, but basically said, it could be a range of things. It could be, brain cancer, brain tumor. Could be something else, but we don't know.
And you posted the scan in the article that you wrote, I think, and it looks like this sort of grape that's just sitting there in your brain.
Yeah, like right. So if you feel in the back of your head, that's your cerebellum, which is like your little brain. So I think most people know about the left brain, right brain hemispheres, but there's actually like the much older human part of the brain, which is the cerebellum, which is kind of like the air traffic control for your brain. I mean, so all visual inputs go in, they go to your cerebellum. Your cerebellum makes sense of visual inputs and also vestibular inputs. So your proprioception, your ability to get balance in the world. And yeah, it had like sprouted this pretty, walnut-sized or large grape-sized little lesion or growth right on my brainstem. And so went to the ER. And, at this point, I saw some neurologists and they kind of said, yeah, we don't know what this is, but you need to get it out immediately. The worst case scenario is it's a glioblastoma, which is brain cancer, brain tumor. And if it's in your brain, it means it's likely metastasized throughout your body. And I was told, pretty much like 6 months, if it was a successful surgery, that's how much, you can expect to live for. Alternatively, if it was something like an abscess, some sort of bacterial abscess, which was extremely rare and in some ways very unlikely, that was more immediately fatal because if it popped, and the abscess, the bacteria from the abscess would get out. It would go directly into my brainstem and mix with my basically the fluid that goes through your spine, and it could be pretty fatal.
But now, when you hear this, do you even have the capacity to like sit back and be like, "Oh my God, what's happening?" Or are you feeling so bad at this point that the moment sort of washes over you?
Yeah, it's like a little bit of an out of body experience. I think the real like devastation for me was, we had an 18-month-old daughter, and just like what hit me was like just not being able to be there for her.
Right. And it wasn't even guaranteed that you were going to wake up from the surgery.
That's right. And it was unclear at that point, even, who would do the surgery, which was another element to the story, which didn't put in the piece, but my like best friend who lives here in Portland, who I've known since college, this Ben Jacobs, the best man, gave a speech at my wedding. So texted him, called him, forget exactly, but said, "This is what's going on." And he said, "Let me call Zach." Zach being a high school friend of his that had recently moved to Portland, who had recently also finished his neurosurgery residency at Stanford and is a brain surgeon. And I had never met Zach, but because he was friends with Ben, we had kind of like in the weeks leading up to this just had like tried to organize a poker game, but then I got sick. And so we never actually met, but I knew of Zach. I knew that Ben had this friend who was a brain surgeon. So Ben calls Zach. Zach was like in the middle of a surgery, but I guess Ben got his wife on the phone. And then his wife contacted Ben or Zach right after his surgery and said, "You got to take a look at Eric's scans." So that day, Zach took a look at the scans and said, "I'll do the surgery. And we got to do it right. We got to do it immediately." So the next day, I got prepped for surgery. That night, I actually, because I was in a different hospital and Zach had to operate in a different hospital, I was actually discharged, went home. As I read about in the piece, kind of grappled with this situation I was in when wrote my daughter a goodbye letter, kind of like very practically got things organized for my wife.
Right. So you thought that this could potentially be your last night.
Yeah.
And you write in the piece, what do you tell an 18-month-old child the day before you die? Sure, you tell them you love them, but what else? How do you cram a lifetime of knowledge into one little letter? What did you write?
I'm not really ready to share that, truthfully.
Okay.
I think it's like, if we're going to, I'll probably just start crying if I start talking about it. So, I will say that the letter is not finished and I continue to write it. So go to the hospital, get ready for surgery, do the surgery. I mean, the surgery itself is like highly risky because you're operating in a part of the brain that, within millimeters, if there's like a mistake, you could potentially just not make it through the surgery. So as far as I recall, Zach's initial plan was to actually biopsy the whatever was in there. And he kind of conferred with his partners, and they very rightly made the decision. A biopsy was a little bit too dangerous because if it were to puncture this lesion, and it was in fact an abscess, it could puncture it, and that could be very dangerous. So in some ways, I think the more risky surgery, which is a full craniotomy, which is to go in, open up the back of the skull, they kind of drill a hole in the skull, cut out the skull, and go in and actually remove it. Did that, and his initial impression upon seeing it was, this doesn't look like cancer. It's like this bizarre abscess. And so I woke up in the ICU. I vaguely remember this, but I do remember seeing Zach standing there. And, my first question was, is it cancer? And he said, "I don't think so." And I'll never forget, but it was just like this odd, just feeling of like relief but then also in like the hours that followed, this uncertainty of, well, are they sure? Like the
Right.
pathology hasn't come back yet.
I mean, just the moment of waking up, like you write it in the story, and it's so powerful. You say the anesthesiologist stepped into the room, count backwards. Anyone who's had surgery knows this, right? Count backwards 10, 9, 8, darkness. And you write, in my mind, I traveled 1,000,000 miles, and then a funny thing happened. I woke up. What was it like waking up?
First of all, I was under a lot of drugs. So, anyone who's woken up from anesthesia knows you're sort of feeling a little bit high, quite literally. But of ultimate like relief, and almost in the hours and the days that followed, a sense of euphoria, which I've been very like fortunate to talk with a lot of people in the last year or so that have gone through these experiences, and there is this like survivor's euphoria that you feel. And I think I was beginning to feel it in that moment of, okay, I made it. Like everything's different now. All of the like things that I thought were important before, I'm recalibrating what actually is important.
Right. And it's such a fascinating story because, as you describe it in your story, you're a long-term oriented investor, always thinking about the long term. And here you're like faced with the prospect of maybe there is no long term. But in good news, it turned out that it was indeed, right, an abscess, and that they cleared it out.
Yeah. I mean, I'll get into the long-term thing in a second, but just to kind of close the loop on the story, it was like an episode of House. They took this thing out. No one could explain where it came from. In the weeks and months that followed, I had to do like really intense intravenous antibiotics to begin with 9 times a day. So I had a port in my arm, and then I had a port in my chest. And after even I was discharged from the hospital, I would have to give myself injections throughout the day of these really hardcore kind of like just intense antibiotics that make the symptoms way worse. It's almost, someone describes it as like kind of like chemotherapy. It just makes you super nauseous. It kills everything in your body.
So you didn't feel instantly better from like the symptoms that you had. They remained even though the abscess was out.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's like a piece of, I mean, there's kind of it's funny. It's like, there's an old Yiddish expression that I remember like my grandparents using called Lackenkopf, which means like, oh, I need this, like I need a hole in my head. And it's like, I have a hole in my head now. Like I know that experience. They took something out. And so, the most important thing is in the months that following, everything looked good. There's no recurrence. There's no like hydrocephalus. It should be fine. I have residual symptoms, but they're manageable. I'm getting through them. The source of the infection was never located, which to this day I get like, infectious disease doctors reaching out to me and like, how did this happen? Like, no one knows. At one point they scanned my jaw and found some sort of lesion in my jaw. So I had surgery, like a really intense surgery in my jaw to remove this thing. Turned out to be totally non-related.
Wow.
So we'll never know. So I think there's like a lot of uncertainty to it, which is part of the experience for me is, so I think the irony, and maybe not the irony, but maybe, just why this story is like so, I think like interesting that it happened is like, I had really based my professional and like kind of personal life around this idea of long-termism. Like as a firm, long-term investors truly believe in the power of compounding. I write about this in a weekly newsletter. Like all good things take time. The whole sort of like, I've been enamored with like the Buffett ideology of just wait it out, patience. And
yeah, you write in the piece that you said, I mean, this is just what you say. Here I was 35 years old, out of time, no more compounding, no more long-termism. And by the way, this is long-termism like in finance, not like the long-termism as far as like AI risk, I don't think. You can correct me
No,
if I'm wrong on that. But
that's
you
correct.
wrote, hell, our firm's tagline that I wrote myself was investors focused on the future. And you quote the Warren Buffett saying that our favorite holding period is forever.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, I mean, in retrospect, it's like, man, that is like a real level of hubris to think you have that. Like, I think that we take this idea for granted, long termism.
Mm-hmm.
It's a nice soundbite, and it's true to say that thinking and acting long term is really, really important. But on a deeper level, it's not guaranteed. None of it is guaranteed, and so anything can derail the long term at any point. And so for me, it was a real like wake up call of, you know, it's a real privilege to have a long term mindset, um, to enjoy the fruits of compounding is like a really lucky position to be in. You know, like I will be really lucky to have a 30-year career of compounding and to not really ever lose sight of that.
Right. Okay, I want to get into how your life has changed since, but I have to ask you a question that's been sitting with me since you talked to us about Zach. Uh, you really entrusted your life to. I mean, of course, you graduated from Stanford, but I imagine a rookie neurosurgeon who a friend recommended. That's bold.
Um, yeah, there. Okay. In that moment, I think that there was actually quite a bit of comfort
Hmm.
in knowing that there was a personal connection. Um, but yeah, I mean, we're like mid 30s. It was like, yeah, you could go with the guy who's like maybe been around or for 20, 30 years doing it, or like you say, a rookie. Um, I think given just the time constraints, it wasn't like I could shop around for a neurosurgeon.
Right.
Um,
Yep. Pretty
the
amazing.
reality was is that it was either Zach or whoever was on call.
Okay. So good job going with Zach.
Zach's the man. Zach
um,
might
you,
give us the Oregon Clinic if anyone needs back surgery or brain surgery.
yeah. And you had a friend who texted you or told you as this was going on, they said this kind of shattering event is showing up right on schedule. It doesn't mean it will all be pleasant, but it might be redemptive. It's the horrendous reset that's going to set you up for a real creative synthesis stage. So of course, like, it only is applicable, if you made it through, and you did make it
Yeah.
through, thankfully. Uh, so I want to hear from your perspective. One of the things that also stuck out for me from the beginning of this story uh, was you described being healthy, but not really being healthy. I think I highlighted this when I was like taking notes on your story. This was the thing that really stuck out for me. You said, I wasn't living an entirely healthy, long-term oriented lifestyle, even though you were like a long-term preaching investor. I was constantly stressed at work. I had stopped exercising. I was glued to my phone and to the market. And in the months leading up to my condition, we were having a rough year, and it was all I could think about. I'd dream about stock prices. I'd wake up in a panic. And to underscore it, you write, despite the ideals of long-termism, I professionally and publicly promoted, I was in fact living a lifestyle that was just the opposite. I was myopically focused on the short term, on success, on the day to day. I avoided seeing friends. My marriage was becoming stressed. Things were unraveling, and I think there's definitely elements of truth of that. When I read it, it reflected in my life for sure, and I think that like it's not a uncommon thing. I think among people working today to feel these very same things.
Yeah.
So, how did you look at that in retrospect after the health incident?
Yeah. I think it's something that probably, even as much as mental health gets talked about now, it probably still isn't really talked about enough of, how we actually in our day to day spend our time. I think if you're ambitious and you're motivated, it's very easy to fall into the sort of like success trap of staying focused on like what's happening today. How can I optimize for today? How can I increase my output? How can I increase performance? And I think you see this online of this sort of like intensity around optimization and performance. And there are elements that are important, and I think really healthy. But I think for me, and probably for a lot of people, it's easy to get a little too, I guess, focused on those sort of like metrics, and
Right, like the next performance review, the stock price, in the
yeah,
quarter, the whatever, the sales
whatever it
number for the
is,
quarter, what happened today.
exactly, right. And I'm abstracting because everyone's situation and profession is different, but I think across like all ambitious, mid-career, later career, whatever it is, like there's an intensity of success, whatever around the KPIs.
Mm-hmm.
And I think coming out of this experience, it's not that I have like a lower level of ambition. I think the ambition is still there to like really put up good numbers and succeed and like have our firm do really well and like for performance to be really good. Those ambitions are still there. It's just maybe put into a bit more of a holistic perspective of how you go about achieving those things. And ultimately, maybe ironically, the more you subtract and the less intense you are, the greater potential for better outcomes. And
Say
I
more
suppose,
about that.
yeah. So I think that like so many things in life, you can't force things. Like you can't force relationships. You can't force success. And I think looking back, and not just in 2022, but like probably a lot of my professional life, there was a lot of like pushing to achieve, and it didn't give enough space for like actual compounding and good things to happen. Um, and so I think that it's been a refocusing in a very simple way of like quality over quantity. So if I'm going to do something, if I'm going to, research a company or write something, or spend time, like just thinking about a new industry that we should invest in, like spend a lot of time doing it, really like high quality time doing something. And same thing with relationships, like
Mm-hmm.
really focus on like important relationships, high quality relationships, and devote time there. And then just cut out the stuff that isn't important.
Yeah, it's like knowing how. Let me see if I can get this right. You tell me if I'm translating this correctly, but knowing how impactful something in the near term can be if you just get it done and then allow that to compound, to use your words, over time, can put a lot of stress on getting that short term thing done. And it's almost like if you're super long term focused, you can really go bananas on the short term because you understand how important that is down the line. I mean, you could even think about like an investment, right? Put some
Yeah.
money in something that compounds. It's like that dollar is worth so much more down the line. So you put a lot of stake on that dollar because you know where it's going to get you downstream. But what you're saying, I think, is like zoom out a bit and realize that a little bit less but higher quality is going to allow you to appreciate the present and
Yeah.
survive in the present. But you'll also then take advantage of that long-term compounding as well.
Yeah. It's like, it's a true less is more attitude. And I think like in practice, what it means is concentration really matters. So I kind of go back to like even my roots as an investor, our firm, like we are concentrated, right? And there's a reason we're concentrated. Because if you spread your bets too thin, you're never really going to create anything meaningful, right? And I think that like that philosophy is true across life. If you try to be friends with 1,000 different people, you're likely not going to be a great friend to 5. Um, and so that has been, this is all, I'm only a year and a half out of this, but for me, I
Hmm.
think like the major takeaway has been concentrate on what really matters. Like focus on what actually matters. The rest is noise. Everything else is noise. I mean, the little stuff, like the little, as you said, like the quarterly earnings, like the little like fluctuations in the market, the like annoying email that you have to respond to, um, the household chores that like you just don't want. Just the little stuff is little,
Hmm.
and really focus on like the actual important things.
Yeah. So there's definitely, I can read in your writing an appreciation for the moment and a way to like sort of think about the bigger picture. Is there anything in particular like that you've changed in your life since, like in terms of the way you spend your time?
I think just more intensity with the things that I'm choosing to spend time with. So
Hmm.
being like with my daughter who just turned 3, who I love to death, but is totally nuts. Like just being really present with her. Whereas before, maybe I was kind of present, but not fully present.
Hmm.
Um, just really leaning into moments with people to develop really close connections. Um, and then, just like in our business, even, I mean, we started transitioning our business to something I really felt like could compound over the long term. And I'm really proud of it. And coming out of this experience, I think it's actually created like some wonderful changes and opportunities from a business perspective that likely wouldn't have happened if, I hadn't gone through this.
Yep. And this is like the list that you give in the story of the things that you're doing differently. You say, I read more, I talk to new people, I made more effort in relationships, no longer think about getting through the day, but what you're building over the long run. I put my phone down and I ask, how do I set up my life today to ensure my kids and their kids will be set up? Do you think that's sustainable? Like trying, I mean, the system is so powerful in dragging you back into sort of this short term thinking. So you said yourself you're just a year and a half out. Do you think you'll be able to sustain this type of mentality?
I hope so. And I'm also like, if you
Yeah.
ask my wife,
Hmm.
she'd probably say he's not, he's not 100% sure. So I
Yeah.
want to be, we should be fact checked on these types of things, and you should have her on, and she can, we can compare notes at one point.
On next week's episode,
Yeah.
Eric's wife, what was true?
Yeah, everything sounds bullshit. No, I think for the big picture stuff, I think she'd agree with. If it's sustainable, it's a constant. I mean, as your audience, who is
Hmm.
probably people much smarter than me, like it's an iterative process. I think my view on even sustainability itself is like just the way to be sustainable is to constantly change the process, constantly tweak it. Sustainability isn't necessarily like you have one system in your life and that's the system you go with. Sustainability is change. There's like flexibility. Uh,
Right.
and so, yeah, just like being long term, I mean, my view on it hasn't totally shifted, but what I have changed, like my view on the long term is not as simple as, well, you do one thing, you hold it, and that's long term. Like the
Hmm.
whole buy and hold thing. I mean, buy and hold like only works if you're like constantly tweaking in the short term and constantly improving to enable like the buy and hold mindset in life.
Hmm.
Um, so it's not as simplistic as, yeah, to be long term, you just, you do one thing and you just like, and it's like the James Clear atomic habit, just a little bit every day. I think it's like actually much more dynamic, and you have to be thinking about making small improvements and small changes. And over time, like that is what creates sustainability, making
Right.
small changes as you go.
Now you said, like, I think pretty definitively in your piece that you believe that the lifestyle that you were leading led to the health issue.
I think that there are so many studies about stress that reveal to me that we don't really fully understand how stress impacts the body, but we know that
Hmm.
stress impacts the body. And I think from like a very simplistic level, I think that my immune system was shot. I
Yeah.
think I would have worked out. And I
Hmm.
think that, um, you know, that stress can kill, and it's a little bit vague how it can kill, but this is one example of how I think it could, which is your immune system gets shot, and then some sneaky little bacteria finds its way through the blood-brain barrier in my case, and it becomes an infection and like the worst part.
Hmm.
And stress also can just lead to other types of issues. I think sleep has become like a really super important like cornerstone of recovery for me, and um, that's something that I've learned a lot about just in the last year and a half of like, if you're not sleeping, you literally like your brain is just not operating at like its full potential.
Right. So what are you at,
Uh,
8 hours?
yeah, if I can. I
Yeah.
mean, we're about to have another kid,
Okay.
so it's like
There
that's
goes the sleep.
yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, but it's a long term bet. The next kid, right?
Oh, yes.
So I think yeah, if I think if you can get 8 hours, like for me that's what works. I go to bed super early.
Hmm.
I don't go out anymore. But I think like all of these things matter, and I think anyone who has like preached like they have the right formula is probably lying to some extent. I think I think it's an iterative process itself of like figuring out what sleep cadence, the food, stress levels. I think that there's
Hmm.
like there's a really healthy balance of both ambition, but also just like not ambition, whatever the opposite of ambition is, of just
Yeah.
relaxing, just enjoying the moment.
Yeah. It is interesting. It's like you were almost killed by the system effectively, and you have decided not to disengage from the system, but just to meet it on your own terms,
Yeah, it's like we're playing by my
by your
game.
rules now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and I mean that's part of the reason why I went public with the story is I think I think a lot of people kind of like feel like they're sort of trapped in this system, right? And it's really it can be overwhelming, um, and you don't really have to play by those rules necessarily. It's very freeing to realize life is very short,
Hmm.
and you get hit by a bus tomorrow, and you can kind of. I'm also like I should point out extremely privileged to be able to do any of these things, right? Like
Hmm.
financially, socially, like just where I was born, just won the lottery by being born where I was. Um, so none of this like I take for granted anymore, and very grateful for it. But for people who are like maybe in a similar position that I was, I just wanted to maybe be somewhat of a voice out there to say, look, I went through this really shitty thing, and I think it was like it happened because of my lifestyle. It's just on
Hmm.
some level,
Yeah.
and coming out of it, I'm not like some genius who has like some incredible perspective. I really don't know if I have any wisdom coming out of this. Um, but I do have like a real grounding for, yeah, what really like matters is not what I thought it did necessarily.
Yep. One more question for you before we wrap. From a personal finance standpoint, I mean, it is interesting. Like a lot of people just like save up, but never really get a chance to see the fruit of all that saving. Like I've heard so many stories of like people who like, rough life, retire, die in the first year of retirement.
Yeah,
Do you think any differently about the way that you approach personal finances now after having gone through this?
that's a really great question. In some ways, yes. I think like I think that inevitably I feel a little bit more averse to risk,
Hmm.
right? And that's like
Mm-hmm.
that's a complex thing to say because that doesn't necessarily mean that um, oh, I go to all cash because I actually think that means like very risky to do something like that. That also doesn't mean like go all in on like index funds, which I think is also very risky. And that's like my particular view of risk. So I the only like practical way that it's changed my view is I focus more on like terminal risk of an investment.
What
Um,
does that mean?
so like building in a scenario in which like I'm completely wrong on the thesis on something in 30 years, what is the odds that this go to zero? Right. Mm-hmm. And I think about that a lot now. I think about that also in the sense of like, nothing lasts forever. I mean, it's, like a renewed sense of just mortality. Nothing lasts forever. Mm-hmm. Things can die at any point. And I think about that with investments and business constantly, which is, this is probably a subject for another discussion, but like the area I've become really focused on is, I think modern culture spends too much time focusing on growth and not enough on survival. Mm-hmm. And when you focus so much on growth, the key metrics you're trying to hit are top line numbers, like something that can grow at 30%, right? What, in my mind, may be a better metric if you're truly trying to think about, okay, can this investment, can this, thesis sustain over 30 years or 40 years? Like, can this provide for my kid? The real question to ask is, can this thing grow at 2% a year, but for 50 years? Mm-hmm. And it's a reframing of an investment idea. And it's one I think that doesn't get talked enough about in business media, and certainly on, if you pull up like Bloomberg or CNBC, they're not, they're saying what happened over this last quarter, right? They're not asking the question of like, will this business exist in 25 years?
I would push back a little bit on that from the CNBC standpoint, but I take your point. Yeah. So you're also writing about the long term, and you have a new column at Big Think, which is this one kicked off the cadence. Yeah, so I'll be writing at Big Think, which is a really great media organization, and their sister site, Free Think, which is also, I think, really high quality journalism, and also just sort of like practical advice for people who work in business. But the column I'll be writing is called The Long Game. It's about the practice and philosophy of long-term thinking. And I'll be writing a column every couple of weeks, in addition to my the newsletter, The Nightcrawler, which I've written for 3 years now. Mm-hmm. And so the like the Nightcrawler is all about just long-term investing and technology trends. The Big Think column will be in a similar vein, about business and technology, but really focused on how people who work in business, investing, entrepreneurs, like really, I think I'm trying to offer some practical ideas and just thoughts about truly playing the long game, both in life and in business. Yeah. Well, Eric, crazy story, a brush with death, and you live to tell the story. And I think these lessons are really universal. And I know I'll be taking them with me as I think more about balancing business and life. And I love that concept of being in the system, but attacking it on your own terms. So thanks so much for joining. Great to speak with you. Yeah, thank you, Alex. It was great to be here and talk to you about it. Awesome. All right, everybody. Thank you for listening. Enjoy another summer weekend, and we'll see you next time on Big Technology Podcast.